You think you know the ocean. You don't. Every rule you've heard about deep sea diving is either incomplete, dangerously wrong, or invented by someone who never left the surface. Here are 31 rules divers must never break. 1. The moment something goes wrong underwater, every instinct in your body screams the same thing. Hold your breath and get to the surface as fast as possible. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like survival. It is one of the most efficient ways to die that physics has ever designed. Boyle's law dictates that as pressure decreases during ascent, gas expands proportionally. At 33 feet down, the pressure is twice what it is on the surface. A breath held from that depth doubles in volume on the way up. Your lungs are not built for that. What happens next has a clinical name: pulmonary barotrauma. That means rupturing lung tissue. The consequences range from a collapsed lung to mediastinal emphysema, which is air flooding your chest cavity, to arterial gas embolism, which is air bubbles entering your bloodstream and traveling directly to your brain. Arterial gas embolism is one of the leading causes of dive-related death and operates on a timeline measured in minutes after surfacing. What makes this particularly merciless is that it does not require depth. A panicked ascent from as shallow as 6 feet, if the breath is held, can generate enough pressure differential to rupture lung tissue. Your lungs have no pain receptors in the right places to warn you this is happening. You feel nothing. You surface. You collapse. The U.S. Navy documented multiple fatalities from exactly this mechanism during experimental diving work in the 1950s, which is a significant part of why formal ascent protocols exist today. Every major certifying agency on the planet lists this as Lesson 1, Rule 1 of open water training: never hold your breath. Emergency rooms around the world still treat breath-hold ascent injuries every year because untrained snorkelers and panicking novice divers forget or were simply never told. The reflex to hold your breath while ascending is so deeply wired that it overrides training under stress, which is exactly why divers practice controlled breathing until it becomes automatic. Holding your breath on the way up is not a survival instinct. It is your body quietly deciding to become a pressure vessel at the single worst possible moment. 2. Most people have a vague understanding that decompression sickness exists and involves pain, and that a hyperbaric chamber sorts it out eventually. The common mental model is something like a very bad hangover, with joint aches that resolves with treatment and leaves no lasting mark. That picture is missing a significant portion of the actual medical reality. Decompression sickness occurs when dissolved nitrogen in the bloodstream and tissues comes out of solution too quickly during ascent, forming bubbles inside the body. Those bubbles do not pick polite locations. They form in joints, in the spinal cord, in the lungs, and in the brain. The medical community divides this into 2 categories. Type 1 affects joints and skin. Type 2 affects the central nervous system, the lungs, and the cardiovascular system, and it can be fatal or permanently disabling within hours of onset. Spinal decompression sickness, which involves bubble formation within spinal cord tissue, can cause paraplegia. This is not a rare edge case buried in obscure medical literature. It is one of the most well-documented forms of serious injury in the diving accident record. The pulmonary version, called the chokes, involves bubble formation in the lungs and produces chest pain, coughing, and respiratory failure. Without rapid treatment, it carries a high mortality rate. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy must begin as quickly as possible. Every hour of delay measurably worsens neurological outcomes. Divers who decide to wait and see if symptoms improve on their own are making a decision that increases the probability of permanent damage with each passing hour. There is also a subclinical version of this injury that receives far less attention. Repeated minor hits that are undiagnosed or dismissed as soreness accumulate over time. Research has shown that these repeated subclinical events produce white matter lesions in the brain consistent with small strokes, even in divers who never felt acutely unwell after any individual dive. In the 19th century, compressed air workers constructing bridge caissons suffered mass casualties from this condition before anyone understood what was causing it. The condition was called caisson disease before anyone called it the bends. The history is long. The injuries are real and frequently permanent. Calling the bends painful but manageable is like calling a structural failure a minor inconvenience, technically in the same universe, catastrophically underselling the outcome. 3. Ask any non-diver what the most dangerous thing in the ocean is, and you will get the same answer roughly 100% of the time. It has a fin, a lot of teeth, and a film franchise. The assumption that sharks represent the primary threat to divers is so culturally embedded that it shapes purchasing decisions, dive site selection, and the internal fear responses of people entering the water. It is also almost entirely disconnected from what the dive fatality record actually shows. Sharks kill fewer than 10 divers globally per year on average. That number is not a rounding error. It is the actual total. Meanwhile, the ocean is filled with invisible, physics-based, and physiological threats that collectively injure and kill orders of magnitude, more people annually, and not one of them appears in a nature documentary with an ominous score. The actual leading causes of diving fatalities are cardiac events, out-of-air emergencies, entrapment, and panic-induced errors in judgment, such as the breath hold ascent covered in Item 1. Nitrogen narcosis alone has sent experienced divers reaching for the regulator that was already in their mouth because they forgot it was there. That is in the accident record. It is not hypothetical. Oxygen toxicity, carbon monoxide contamination from poorly maintained fill stations, and equipment failure round out a threat profile that has no fins and generates no merchandise. Cone snails, blue-ringed octopuses, and certain jellyfish species carry venom that operates on timelines and in quantities that make them genuinely dangerous, and they look nothing like what people imagine when they think about ocean threats. Invisible thermoclines and haloclines, which are boundaries between water masses of different temperature or salinity, have caused sudden disorientation and vertigo severe enough to trigger emergency responses from divers who had no idea what just happened to their perception. Strong underwater currents and unexpected downwellings have dragged divers below their planned depth faster than they could respond. The International Shark Attack File, maintained by the University of Florida, consistently confirms that unprovoked fatal shark attacks on scuba divers are statistically negligible compared to every other threat on this list. Worrying exclusively about sharks while diving is like refusing to board a commercial flight because you are concerned about being struck by lightning inside the aircraft. Both things can technically happen. Neither one is what is going to get you. 4. Solo diving carries a specific reputation in recreational circles. It is treated as the advanced move, the expert-level choice, the graduation from needing supervision. Experienced divers sometimes frame it as freedom. The industry has even created a solo diving specialty certification, which at least acknowledges that solo diving requires additional equipment and training, rather than simply being an extension of existing skills. But the framing of solo diving as a natural evolution of expertise misses the central point of why the buddy system exists, which is not about skill level at all. The buddy system is not a beginner courtesy. It is the primary emergency response infrastructure of recreational diving. A buddy can donate air, control a panicking diver's ascent rate, signal for help from the surface, and perform in-water rescue. A solo diver has access to none of these interventions. The critical variable is time. A diver who loses consciousness underwater from oxygen toxicity, a cardiac event, or a severe narcosis episode will drown before surfacing unless another diver physically intervenes. Buddy response time in documented scenarios averages under 30 seconds. Solo response time is infinite because there is no response. Divers Alert Network fatality reports consistently show that a disproportionate percentage of dive deaths involve solo diving or separation from a buddy at the moment the incident occurred. Equipment failures, which in buddy scenarios are manageable problems, become potential fatalities when the diver is alone. A free-flowing regulator with a buddy is an inconvenience and an immediate air share. Without a buddy, it is a rapidly depleting gas supply with no backup. The solo diving specialty certification that does exist requires redundant equipment, including an independent air source, a surface marker buoy, and a cutting tool, and it requires explicit acknowledgement of an elevated risk profile. It is not simply advanced recreational diving. It is a fundamentally different risk calculation. The most experienced divers in the world, including military combat divers and technical wreck penetration divers, almost universally operate with a partner or team. Their experience did not teach them that solo diving is safe. It taught them precisely why it is not. Solo diving because you are experienced is like removing your seatbelt because you have been driving for 20 years. The belt was never about how good you are at driving. 5. Nitrogen narcosis gets discussed in recreational diving communities in a way that subtly implies it is a beginner problem. The narrative goes that inexperienced divers who panic at depth are susceptible, while seasoned veterans with thousands of log dives have effectively developed an immunity through exposure. This narrative is wrong in a way that is directly dangerous. Nitrogen narcosis has no immunity. It affects every diver at every experience level without exception. It is caused by the anesthetic effect of nitrogen gas under pressure acting on the central nervous system. This is a direct function of partial pressure, not fitness level, experience, psychology, or mental toughness. What experience provides is recognition of the early stages, and even that recognition is compromised by the very condition the diver is trying to identify. Jacques Cousteau, who was by any reasonable measure among the most experienced divers in history, documented his own narcosis episodes extensively and was explicit that he never became immune, only more familiar with its early onset. Narcosis typically becomes noticeable below 30 meters in most divers, though individual sensitivity varies. By 40 meters, which is the accepted recreational depth limit, impairment can be significant. Below 60 meters, narcosis alone can render a diver functionally incapacitated. The paradox that makes this particularly insidious is that narcosis actively degrades the diver's ability to assess their own level of impairment. Divers operating under significant narcosis frequently report feeling exceptionally clear-headed and capable. This is identical to the subjective experience of someone who has consumed enough alcohol to be legally impaired, but is fully convinced they are fine. Documented narcosis incidents in the accident record include divers attempting to share their regulator with fish, divers descending further into the water column during an emergency instead of ascending, and divers becoming so euphoric that they failed to respond to genuine distress signals from their buddy. Narcosis resolves completely upon ascending to shallower depth and produces no lasting physiological damage on its own. This makes it uniquely dangerous because the recovery is so clean that the memory of the impairment is poor and the diver returns to depth again. Technical divers working below recreational limits replace nitrogen with helium in their breathing mix because helium does not produce the same effect at equivalent pressures. Thinking experience cures narcosis is thinking a veteran drinker cannot get drunk. The chemistry does not check your logbook. 6. Dive computers get treated as the modern replacement for dive tables, and the assumption in most recreational diving contexts is that using one versus the other is a matter of personal preference. Some divers use computers because they are convenient. Others use tables because they are traditional. The general impression is that both systems produce the same result through different interfaces, and swapping between them mid-trip is simply a matter of preference rather than a technical decision with physiological consequences. This impression is incorrect, and the error is invisible right up until it is not. Dive tables, including the standard US, Navy tables, and the PADI Recreational Dive Planner, use a square profile calculation. They assume the diver spent the entire planned dive duration at the maximum planned depth. This is conservative because actual dives involve a descent, an exploration phase at varying depths, and an ascent. Dive computers track nitrogen loading in real time using continuous algorithms, updating calculations throughout the dive based on actual depth and time data. The two systems produce different nitrogen loading outcomes for identical dives. If a diver uses a computer on the first dive and then switches to a table for the second dive, the table has no record of what the computer calculated. The diver is planning their surface interval and second dive based on data the table has never seen. Conversely, a diver who switches computers between dive days is carrying a nitrogen load that the new device has no history of. Surface interval calculations, which determine how long a diver must rest between dives, are specific to whichever system computed the preceding dive's nitrogen load. Mixing systems at this stage is where invisible risk accumulates. Divers Alert Network incident reports contain documented cases where multi-day diving trip decompression sickness events were directly attributable to inconsistent use of tracking systems across consecutive dive sequences. The conservative and universally recommended approach is straightforward. Choose one system, use it exclusively for the entire trip, and treat a computer's permissions as data to be respected rather than invitations to push limits. Switching between a dive computer and a table mid-trip and trusting either one is like two banks tracking the same loan on separate spreadsheets using different interest calculations. Nobody has the correct total. The debt exists regardless of which number you are looking at. 7. Resort divers on island holidays routinely book morning dives and afternoon flights. The logic seems airtight. The dive computer cleared them, they feel completely normal, and the flight is hours away. The combination of feeling fine and having a device show green indicators is treated as definitive evidence that getting on a plane is safe. It is not definitive evidence of anything, except that the diver does not fully understand what pressurized aircraft cabins do to nitrogen-loaded tissue. Commercial aircraft are pressurized to approximately 75% of sea level atmospheric pressure, equivalent to an altitude of roughly 6,000 to 8,000 feet above sea level. That reduction in pressure is sufficient to cause dissolved nitrogen in diver tissue to form bubbles, which is decompression sickness, in a diver whose surface interval was inadequate. Divers Alert Network and all major certifying agencies have established minimum pre-flight surface intervals based on this physics. The minimum for a single no decompression dive is 12 hours. For multiple dives across a day, the minimum rises to 18 hours. For any dive that required decompression stops, the recommended minimum is 24 hours, and conservative practice suggests longer. The reason divers feel fine immediately after a dive is that decompression sickness symptoms frequently do not appear immediately. Nitrogen bubbles can take 6 to 24 hours to develop to a size and location that produces noticeable symptoms. A diver boarding a flight with no symptoms is not necessarily safe. They may be on a timeline that places symptom onset at cruise altitude or hours after landing. There are documented cases of divers experiencing full neurological decompression sickness events during commercial flights within hours of their final dive. The altitude problem extends beyond aircraft. Mountain driving after diving presents an identical risk. A driver crossing a high mountain pass at 8,000 to 10,000 feet of elevation is operating in the same pressure environment as a commercial aircraft cabin. Resort dive operators frequently offer last-day dive itineraries that are structurally incompatible with standard pre-flight surface intervals. The responsibility for managing that timeline belongs entirely to the diver, not the operator. Flying after diving because you feel fine is like removing a cast because your arm does not hurt anymore. The internal state of the tissue does not coordinate its schedule with your comfort level. 8. Oxygen has an overwhelmingly positive public reputation. It is the thing paramedics give you. It treats decompression sickness. Divers breathe it. Enriched air nitrox, which contains more oxygen than standard air, is marketed as a way to extend bottom time and reduce nitrogen loading, which is accurate. The conclusion many divers draw from this, that more oxygen is generally safer and better, particularly at depth, is not accurate. It is the kind of reasoning that sounds right until the specific chemistry involved is understood. Oxygen becomes acutely toxic at elevated partial pressures. The threshold that matters for divers is relatively specific. Below it, oxygen is life-sustaining. Above it, it triggers grand mal seizures. Underwater, with no warning, no prodrome, no time to respond. Central nervous system oxygen toxicity produces sudden, uncontrolled, tonic-clonic seizures in a diver who was functioning normally seconds before. A seizing diver expels their regulator, becomes unable to control buoyancy, and drowns. The entire sequence from onset to fatal outcome can occur in under a minute. The maximum partial pressure of oxygen recommended for recreational diving is 1.4 atmospheres absolute. The hard ceiling for decompression stop use is 1.6 atmospheres absolute. Partial pressure is a function of the oxygen percentage in the breathing mix and the depth. A diver breathing standard air, which is 21% oxygen, does not approach toxic partial pressures within recreational depth limits. A diver breathing a 40% nitrox mix hits the 1.4 atmosphere limit at approximately 24 meters, well within recreational range. The lethal aspect of this rule is that oxygen toxicity seizures can occur without any warning symptoms whatsoever. Experienced technical divers with hundreds of dives on oxygen-rich mixes have seized with no prior indication on those specific dives. There is no reliable individual warning system. The U.S. Navy maintains strict oxygen exposure tracking tables for all operational diving precisely because accumulated oxygen exposure across multiple dives increases seizure risk, even when individual dive profiles look safe on paper. The therapeutic use of 100% oxygen to treat decompression sickness at the surface is safe because the partial pressure at 1 atmosphere is only 1.0, well below the toxic threshold. Depth is the variable that changes everything. More oxygen at depth is not better. It is a very precise route to a seizure in open water. 9. A wetsuit occupies a specific mental category for most divers. It is the thing that keeps you warm. The protection is real. Neoprene works. The assumption that follows from this, that a wetsuit worn at the surface will continue to provide equivalent thermal protection throughout a dive, is where the gap between expectation and physics opens up. Neoprene wetsuits function by trapping a thin layer of water against the skin. The body heats that layer, and the neoprene resists heat transfer from that warmed layer to the surrounding cold water. The critical detail is that neoprene is a foam material, and foam compresses under pressure. At depth, increased ambient pressure compresses the neoprene, reducing its thickness, and, critically, reducing its insulating value. A 5mm wetsuit that provides solid thermal protection at the surface may function as an effective 2 to 3mm suit at significant depth. The suit the diver evaluated during the pre-dive check at the surface is not the suit performing thermal management at the bottom of the planned dive. Cold incapacitation, which is the progressive loss of muscular control caused by dropping peripheral and core temperature, can affect a diver long before hypothermia reaches clinically dangerous levels. Fine motor control is the first casualty. Hands lose dexterity before a diver experiences anything they would describe as seriously cold. This matters because critical equipment manipulation, including regulator recovery, BCD inflation adjustment, and navigation device operation, requires fine motor control that cold, incapacitated hands cannot reliably provide. Water conducts heat away from the body 25 times faster than air at the same temperature. There is no land-based frame of reference that accurately communicates how rapidly cold water extracts heat from an inadequately protected diver. Thermoclines in the water column can drop temperature by 10 degrees Celsius or more within a single meter of vertical distance. A diver descending through a thermocline moves from comfortable to seriously cold water without warning and without time to adjust equipment. Dry suits address the compression problem by using an insulating air layer rather than a water layer, which maintains its properties regardless of depth. Trusting a wetsuit to perform identically at 30 meters, as it did on the surface, is trusting a piece of foam to ignore the same physics that governs everything else in the underwater environment. It does not. 10. The surface marker buoy gets treated by many recreational divers as optional safety gear. It is the item that careful divers carry, that cautious operators require, and that experienced divers sometimes decide they do not need because the water looks clear, the boat crew knows where they went in, and nothing is going to go wrong. This reasoning contains multiple layers of flawed assumption, and the one it gets most wrong is the visibility problem. A diver surfacing from a dive is essentially invisible at sea level. Head-up profile height above the waterline is less than 30 centimeters. In moderate chop, even a small group of divers surfacing together can be invisible to a boat operator at 50 meters range. A powerboat traveling at speed closes 50 meters in seconds. Boat propeller injuries to divers are documented annually across all global dive regions. Many involve divers surfacing under or near vessels operated by people who had no awareness that a dive was in progress. Deploying a surface marker buoy before surfacing provides a 1 to 2 meter visible signal from depth, giving boat traffic warning before the diver reaches the surface. The dive flag displayed at the boat marks where the diver entered the water. If the diver has moved with current, navigated laterally, or is completing a drift dive, the flag's position is entirely disconnected from where the diver will surface. Drift diving, in which current carries divers horizontally during the dive, is the scenario where the SMB is most clearly not optional. In a drift dive, the entry point is irrelevant to the exit point. The SMB is the only viable mechanism by which the diver communicates position to the surface. Large delayed surface marker buoys deployed from depth using a reel are standard equipment in technical and professional diving for exactly this reason. Night diving without an SMB and a dive light creates surface recovery conditions that are essentially impossible without prior position knowledge. Not carrying a surface marker buoy because the water looks clear is the underwater equivalent of not wearing a hard hat because nothing has fallen yet. The traffic above the surface does not organize itself around what you are optimistic about. 11. Ear equalization gets treated by beginner divers as a comfort hurdle rather than a physiological threshold. The pressure feeling on descent is unpleasant, and the instinct is to push through it, reasoning that the feeling will resolve once deeper. Dive instructors report this as one of the most common errors they correct in new students, and also one of the errors most likely to reappear once students are diving independently without supervision. Failure to equalize is one of the most common causes of dive-related injury in the entire sport. The mechanics are not complicated. The middle ear is an air-filled space connected to the throat by the eustachian tubes. During descent, increasing water pressure compresses this airspace. Without active equalization through one of the established techniques, the pressure differential across the eardrum increases until tissue failure occurs. That tissue failure is called tympanic membrane rupture. It is painful, it causes immediate vertigo from cold water entering the middle ear, and the resulting disorientation can be severe enough to cause complete loss of directional orientation underwater, which is a drowning scenario. Inner ear barotrauma is a more serious injury involving damage to the membranes within the inner ear itself. This produces permanent sensorineural hearing loss, tinnitus, and vertigo that can require surgical repair and may never fully resolve. Attempting to equalize against existing pain is significantly less effective than equalizing before discomfort starts, because the eustachian tube is already under external pressure and partially collapsed. The correct technique requires equalizing early and continuously during descent, beginning before pressure is felt. Divers who attempt to continue descent by forcing the equalization after the point of discomfort are doing the physiological equivalent of pushing against a door that is already braced from the other side and expecting it to give. Diving while congested from illness, allergies, or sinus inflammation dramatically increases the risk of failed equalization and also creates the conditions for reverse block on ascent, when nasal decongestants wear off mid-dive and the eustachian tubes close. Divers Alert Network data consistently identifies ear and sinus barotrauma as the highest volume injury category in recreational diving, not decompression sickness, not oxygen toxicity. Ears. Pushing through an unequalized ear is not mental toughness. It is underwriting a permanent injury with your eardrum. 12. The experience transfer assumption is one of the most durable and damaging in recreational diving. It goes like this. Diving is diving. Depth and conditions are just difficulty settings, and a diver who is comfortable in warm tropical reef environments is simply a less experienced version of a diver who can handle cold water, low visibility, and current-heavy environments. Time and logged dives will bridge the gap automatically. This framing is wrong in a way that produces a specific and predictable type of fatal dive accident. Different diving environments do not represent versions of the same sport at varying difficulty. They introduce failure modes that warm water recreational training did not cover, did not simulate, and did not prepare the diver to recognize or manage. Cold water diving requires thermal management skills, and dry suits, which are the appropriate thermal solution for genuinely cold environments, require a separate certification because they have their own buoyancy management system that behaves differently from a wetsuit under air compression. Cold water also causes certain regulators to free flow, dumping an entire tank in minutes, a failure mode that warm water divers have no trained response to because they have never encountered it. Low visibility diving, defined as anything under roughly 1 meter of horizontal visibility, eliminates the navigation references that warm water divers rely on automatically. Following a reef wall, using the bottom contour as orientation, tracking buddy position visually, all of it disappears. Overhead environments, including caves, caverns, and wreck interiors, remove the option to make a direct emergency ascent. Any diver entering an overhead environment without specific training for that environment is operating outside every safety standard in the industry. Cave diving requires an entirely separate training paradigm built around gas planning, guideline navigation, zero visibility protocols, and redundant light systems. Altitude diving in high elevation freshwater lakes requires modified decompression calculations because surface pressure is already reduced, compressing safety margins. The dive accident record contains a disproportionate number of incidents involving experienced warm water divers who entered new environments without environment-specific training. Tropical reef certification qualifying you for a cold water cave is like a commercial pilot's license qualifying you to fly a helicopter. Both involve aircraft, controls, and the potential for catastrophic failure. The similarity ends there. 13. The air in a scuba tank gets treated as a neutral, standardized product. Divers assume that a fill station with a compressor and a tank rack produces the same clean compressed air regardless of location, maintenance history, or intake placement. The tank gets filled, the pressure reads correctly, and the assumption is that the contents match what the label implies. This assumption can kill a diver without providing any sensory warning whatsoever. Scuba compressors must draw intake air from sources free of vehicle exhaust, industrial fumes, and combustion byproducts. A compressor intake positioned near an engine exhaust, a generator, or an industrial source will compress those contaminants into the tank alongside the air. Carbon monoxide contamination of tank fills is a documented cause of diver death. Carbon monoxide is colorless, odorless, and tasteless. Underwater, a diver breathing a CO-contaminated fill receives no sensory cue that anything is wrong. The first symptom may be loss of consciousness. Carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin approximately 250 times more readily than oxygen, displacing oxygen from the bloodstream at the cellular level. The bright red skin coloration associated with severe carbon monoxide poisoning is not visible through a wetsuit and mask in dive conditions. Multiple documented fatalities exist involving contaminated fills from compressors that were poorly maintained, improperly sited relative to exhaust sources, or using degraded filters past their service interval. Fill stations in most jurisdictions are required to perform periodic air quality testing to maintain oxygen, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and oil content within specified limits. The testing schedule recommendations are not universally adhered to by every facility worldwide. Nitrox and trimix fills require an additional verification step. The diver should analyze the actual oxygen percentage in the completed fill before diving. Breathing a mix containing more oxygen than the dive plan assumed creates oxygen toxicity risk at depths that would be safe for the labeled percentage. Tank visual inspections and hydrostatic pressure testing required on a regular schedule detect physical tank deterioration before it produces a catastrophic failure. A tank with internal corrosion, a cracked valve, or a compromised burst disc is not a minor equipment concern. Trusting any fill station with your breathing gas because it has a compressor is like trusting any kitchen with your food because it has a stove. The equipment's presence tells you nothing about what went into it. 14. People consistently describe what drowning looks like using the same reference points: shouting for help, waving arms, splashing violently. This picture comes from film, television, and secondhand accounts of distress situations. It is an accurate description of aquatic distress. It is not an accurate description of drowning, and the difference between those two things is the difference between a situation where bystanders recognize and respond to an emergency and a situation where they watch someone die while assuming nothing is wrong. Real drowning is physiologically silent and visually unremarkable. The term instinctive drowning response describes the involuntary physiological cascade that takes over during actual drowning. During this response, the respiratory system overrides everything else in an attempt to breathe. The mouth alternately drops below and rises above the waterline in rapid succession. This means the person cannot exhale long enough to form words. They cannot shout. They cannot call for help. The arms press laterally against the water surface in an automatic attempt to leverage the body upright. This means a drowning person cannot raise their arms to wave. Those arms are committed to the instinctive motion. The body is nearly vertical in the water, with little or no leg kick. From any distance, a drowning person looks like someone treading water calmly, or pausing to look at something below the surface. There is nothing visually dramatic happening. Active drowning in this instinctive response phase lasts only 20 to 60 seconds before submersion occurs. The recognition window is extremely short, and the visual signal is almost nothing. Surface support divers and dive boat crew require specific training in recognizing the instinctive drowning response because it looks so unremarkable that untrained observers routinely miss it. The dramatic, arm-waving, vocally distressed version of drowning is called aquatic distress. Distressed swimmers still have enough buoyancy and energy to signal. Actual drowning victims have already crossed the threshold where signaling is physiologically impossible. Waiting for a drowning person to announce themselves is like waiting for an unconscious fighter to tap out. The condition that makes the response necessary is precisely the condition that makes the response impossible. 15. Novice divers frequently rank mask flooding among their most feared underwater scenarios. The fear is understandable on a basic level Because water entering the mask, where air should be, feels like a problem. It triggers the same internal alarm system as any unexpected intrusion of water near the face. The fear is also disproportionate in a way that has direct consequences, because it is not the flooded mask that kills people. It is the response to the flooded mask. A flooded mask is a minor equipment inconvenience. The regulator in the diver's mouth continues delivering breathable air entirely, regardless of what is happening to the mask. A diver who loses their mask entirely while keeping their regulator in their mouth is not in physiological danger from the mask loss. The danger is exclusively behavioral. Panic in response to a flooded mask produces a predictable sequence in untrained or underpracticed divers. The diver grabs simultaneously at the mask and potentially the regulator, may accidentally dislodge the regulator while clearing the mask, experiences the additional alarm of losing their air source, and initiates an emergency ascent that may involve a breath hold. The mask inconvenience has now escalated through a chain of reactive decisions to the breath hold ascent scenario from item 1. Open water certification requires mask removal, flooding, and clearing exercises specifically to eliminate the fear novelty response at depth before the diver encounters it during an actual dive. Cognitive narrowing under stress, which is a well-documented psychological phenomenon in which high stress reduces problem-solving ability and narrows attentional focus, means a panicking diver is least capable of executing the simple skill required precisely at the moment when they most need it. The trained response takes under 5 seconds. Tilt the head back slightly. Hold the top of the mask frame against the forehead. Exhale steadily through the nose. The mask clears. The dive continues. Professional commercial divers regularly conduct operations with no mask in conditions where full face equipment is not used. The absence of the mask is not the emergency. The behavior it triggers in divers who have not practiced the clearing procedure until it is automatic is the emergency. Panicking over a flooded mask is like stopping your car and calling for assistance because rain hit the windshield. The window got wet. The vehicle still functions. Continue. 16. The buddy octopus regulator setup is understood by recreational divers as the emergency air solution. One diver runs out of air. The buddy donates from the octopus, and both ascend together safely. The concept is correct. The assumption that frequently gets attached to it, that a single remaining tank represents effectively unlimited emergency air, is incorrect in a way that has specific and calculable consequences depending on depth, remaining pressure, and the breathing rates of two stressed divers. Under stress, human breathing rate increases substantially. Resting consumption is approximately 15 liters per minute. Under emergency conditions, breathing rates can reach 30 to 40 liters per minute or higher in a stressed diver. Two divers sharing a single tank under the breathing rates, typical of a genuine emergency, can consume air at 2 to 3 times the normal planning rate. Gas consumption at depth is proportional to ambient pressure. At 30 meters, which is 4 atmospheres of pressure, a diver consumes air 4 times faster than at the surface. Air sharing at 30 meters doubles this demand across 2 people. The minimum ascent from 30 meters at a safe rate, including a 5-minute safety stop, creates a time-to-surface calculation that requires a specific volume of gas to cover at elevated consumption rates. A fundamental planning principle called the rule of thirds is designed to address exactly this math. Reserve 1/3 of gas for the outbound portion of the dive, 1/3 for the return, and 1/3 as an emergency reserve. Divers who enter emergencies with tank pressure already below the minimum reserve threshold are operating with genuinely insufficient gas for safe emergency management. Technical divers carry independent redundant gas supplies on stages and bailout cylinders precisely because the mathematics of emergency gas sharing from a single primary tank becomes unfavorable at technical depths with decompression obligations. A free-flowing regulator, which is a failure mode in which the regulator dumps gas continuously, can empty a full tank in under 2 minutes. Managing an air share while also managing a free-flowing secondary regulator is a situation that deteriorates faster than most divers have specifically trained to address. Assuming one tank is unlimited emergency air for 2 stressed divers is assuming one fuel tank covers any trip because it was full at departure. The math was always there. Emergencies just run it faster. 17. The 40-meter recreational depth limit is treated by a notable portion of experienced recreational divers as a conservative industry guideline rather than a genuine physiological boundary. The framing goes that certifying agencies set conservative limits for liability reasons, that genuinely experienced divers have the skill to manage somewhat deeper, and that pushing to 45 or 50 meters on recreational equipment is simply an extension of what they are already doing. This framing misunderstands what the 40-meter limit actually represents. The limit exists at the intersection of multiple independent physiological hard limits that compound at depth. At 40 meters, which is 5 atmospheres of pressure, a diver breathing standard air has a partial pressure of oxygen approaching 1.05 atmospheres absolute. This is within the safe range, but trending toward the recreational limit of 1.4. The partial pressure of nitrogen at this depth produces significant narcosis in most individuals. No decompression limits on standard air at 40 meters are approximately 10 minutes of bottom time. 10 minutes. After that, a mandatory decompression obligation exists that cannot be safely resolved without a staged descent, additional breathing gas, and decompression equipment that a recreational diver does not carry. An emergency ascent from 40 meters at the maximum safe rate, including a safety stop, takes a minimum of 3 to 5 minutes. A buddy must carry sufficient gas for both divers through this entire profile under elevated stress breathing rates. The transition zone between 40 and 60 meters is where multiple physiological risks compound simultaneously rather than linearly. Each additional meter below 40 adds narcosis impairment, oxygen toxicity exposure, and decompression obligation faster than the preceding meter. Technical diving training addresses sub-40 meter operations, specifically because it requires different gas planning, redundant equipment, decompression theory knowledge, and procedural discipline that open water and advanced recreational certification do not cover. The 40-meter recreational limit is not a conservative approximation of a comfortable operational ceiling. It is the depth at which the management of foreseeable emergencies on recreational equipment and training becomes structurally inadequate. Treating it as a suggestion is like treating a bridge weight rating as a conservative estimate. The number is not about caution. It is about what the system was designed to hold. 18. Dive training places heavy emphasis on staying calm, and the popular understanding that follows is that mentally composed divers are protected from panic-induced incidents by virtue of their psychological preparedness. This is a partial truth that conceals a more significant reality. Panic in diving is not exclusively a psychological event that calm mindset prevents. It is frequently a physiological cascade driven by physical triggers that produce a panic response independently of the diver's mental state, experience level, or deliberate intention. Hypercapnia, which is elevated carbon dioxide in the blood, is the most common physiological trigger of panic in divers. It occurs from skip breathing, which is the practice of deliberately slowing breathing to conserve air, from overexertion, from poor regulator performance, or from CO2 retaining breathing patterns some divers develop unconsciously. Elevated CO2 directly stimulates the brainstem's distress response, regardless of what the diver is consciously thinking. Skip breathing is explicitly contraindicated in dive training because it allows CO2 to accumulate while oxygen levels remain relatively normal. The diver does not feel hypoxic. They feel fine right up to the moment the brainstem's CO2 alarm overrides everything else. Dynamic apnea blackout, which is relevant in freediving contexts and a hazard to any breath-hold diver in recreational water environments, occurs when oxygen levels drop below the consciousness threshold without adequate CO2 warning, the direct result of hyperventilating before a breath hold. The diver loses consciousness without prior subjective warning. Breathing resistance from a poorly serviced or out-of-specification regulator increases the mechanical work of breathing, which elevates CO2 production and compounds the physiological trigger pathway. Cold shock from inadequate thermal protection produces a hormonal and respiratory response that can trigger hyperventilation independently of psychological state, particularly during initial immersion in cold water. Experienced divers are not physiologically immune to these triggers. Divers Alert Network accident records include instructor-level divers who experienced incapacitating panic cascades from hypercapnia events that were physically, not psychologically, initiated. The appropriate trained response is specific. Stop all activity, breathe slowly and completely, to clear CO2, establish neutral buoyancy, and hold position. This requires practiced procedure, not simply a calm personality. Believing calm disposition prevents dive panic is believing a cheerful attitude prevents seasickness. The physiology does not negotiate with the attitude. 19. Freshwater diving, particularly in lakes and quarries, carries a reputation as a gentler, more controlled alternative to ocean diving. The recommendation is common. Nervous divers, new divers, or divers returning from a long break are frequently directed toward inland freshwater sites as lower stakes environments. The reasoning is logical on its surface. No tidal currents, no marine life hazards, no boat traffic of the density found at coastal sites. The reasoning does not hold up against the freshwater dive fatality record, which contains a disproportionate number of deaths relative to the volume of diving conducted in those environments. Freshwater quarries typically contain thick silt deposits on the bottom that disturb instantly and completely at the contact of a fin kick, creating zero visibility conditions within seconds. A diver who silts out inside any overhead structure at a quarry site, including a sunken vehicle, building, or pier section, faces a navigation emergency with no natural light reference and no surface visibility. Thermoclines in freshwater lakes can be more severe than those in ocean environments, producing temperature drops of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius within a single vertical meter. The disorientation produced by passing through a sharp thermocline, including vertigo and the physical shock of sudden temperature change, is a documented factor in freshwater dive incidents. Freshwater provides slightly less buoyancy than saltwater, meaning divers accustomed to their standard weight configuration in the ocean may be significantly overweighted in a freshwater environment, creating buoyancy control problems that are most apparent at depth. Altitude diving, which applies to any diving in freshwater lakes at elevation, requires modified decompression calculations because ambient surface pressure is already reduced relative to sea level. Standard dive tables and many computer default settings are calibrated for sea level conditions and are not safe for altitude diving without correction. Cold freshwater causes certain regulator designs to ice internally and free flow at temperatures that would not produce the same failure in a warmer marine environment. The absence of stinging jellyfish and current does not compensate for the accumulated environmental hazards specific to freshwater diving. Thinking freshwater is automatically safer than ocean diving is, thinking country roads are automatically safer than highways. The absence of traffic does not eliminate the other ways to lose control of the situation entirely. 20. Displaying a dive flag is treated as a reliable traffic control measure. The flag means boats will maintain their distance. The diver below is protected by a legal right-of-way, and the system works as intended. This belief depends on a chain of conditions. Boat operators must see the flag, recognize it, know the required clearance distance, and comply. Each of those conditions fails regularly in real-world conditions, and none of them are guaranteed. The red and white recreational dive flag, predominantly used in North American waters, and the blue and white International Maritime Signal Flag Alpha indicating a diver in the water are legally recognized signals in most jurisdictions. The required standoff distance varies significantly. U.S. federal rules require 100 feet. Florida state law requires 300 feet in open water, and international rules follow maritime convention with different specifications. Enforcement across all these frameworks is minimal. A flag on a stationary surface float marks the diver's entry point. In any dive involving horizontal navigation, lateral current drift, or deliberate exploration of a different area, the flag is physically decoupled from the diver's actual underwater position. Drift diving makes this problem complete. The entry point is irrelevant to the exit point in a drift dive, and the flag left at the entry does not follow the diver along the current. Boat operators in recreational boating areas, including rental boaters and personal watercraft operators, may not recognize a dive flag, may not see it in CHOP at operational boat speeds, or may not know the required clearance distance because no licensing is required to know it. A small dive float in moderate CHOP at 100 meters range is difficult to detect from a powerboat at speed. The surface marker buoy deployed during ascent from depth provides a position-accurate, higher visibility signal at precisely the moment it matters. The practical reality of dive flag protection is this. It establishes legal right-of-way, which is valuable in a liability determination, and completely irrelevant to a diver who has already been struck by a propeller. Depending on a dive flag to prevent a boat strike is depending on a crosswalk to stop a vehicle operated by someone who is not paying attention. The legal right is real. The physics of a vessel in motion respect it only if the operator does. 21. Night diving is frequently framed as daytime diving after dark, a variation on a familiar activity, rather than an environment with its own operational requirements. Certified divers who are comfortable in well-lit, familiar conditions approach night versions of the same sites with the expectation that their existing skills will transfer. The site is the same. The techniques are the same. The difference is just the light. The difference is not just the light. Navigation by natural reference, which is the primary method recreational divers use to maintain orientation and return to exit points, is entirely eliminated in night diving. Following the reef contour, using ambient light angle as directional reference, tracking buddy position visually across open water, none of it is available. Compass navigation becomes the only reliable directional system, and it requires current, practice skill that many recreational divers have not maintained since their certification checkout dives. Buddy management in night diving requires pre-established light signal protocols, specific patterns that communicate standard diver messages in conditions where hand signals are invisible beyond arm's length. Without these protocols established before the dive, the primary communication system of recreational diving does not function. Primary torchlight creates a tunnel vision effect that narrows the diver's effective perceptual field to the beam, while simultaneously eliminating peripheral awareness. This is the operational opposite of daytime reef diving, where the full visual field is available at all times. Marine life behavior changes substantially at night. Nocturnal species that sheltered during daylight hours are active and mobile after dark, creating environmental complexity that can disorient divers who are familiar only with the daytime reef community at that site. Equipment failures that would be quickly identified and managed in ambient light are significantly harder to detect and respond to in restricted illumination. The total failure of a primary light source in a night dive produces complete disorientation with no ambient light backup. Night diving specialty certification addresses light protocols, modified navigation procedures, entry and exit management, and emergency signaling systems that have no equivalent in daytime open water training. Night diving without specific preparation is not daytime diving after hours. It is a different operating environment that happens to share a geographic location with a place you were previously comfortable. That shared location is where the similarity ends. 22. Hyperventilating before a breath hold dive is one of those techniques that circulates through freediving communities and recreational swimming environments with an air of insider knowledge. The logic sounds physiologically plausible. Blow off carbon dioxide before the dive, delay the urge to breathe, extend bottom time. It is practiced widely enough that many people who engage in breath hold diving are aware of it and treat it as a standard preparation technique. It is the primary cause of shallow water blackout and is responsible for a significant proportion of freediving deaths. The urge to breathe is not triggered by low oxygen. It is triggered by rising carbon dioxide, detected by chemoreceptors monitoring arterial blood CO2 concentration. When CO2 rises to a sufficient level, the brainstem generates a compelling, then irresistible urge to breathe. Oxygen level has no direct input into this warning signal in the overwhelming majority of people. Hyperventilation reduces CO2 below its normal concentration. It does not load additional oxygen into the blood or tissues beyond normal saturation levels. The blood is already at approximately 98 to 99% oxygen saturation before hyperventilation begins. Hyperventilation does not add more. It only removes the warning signal by starting the dive with artificially low CO2. During the breath hold dive, oxygen is consumed normally. As oxygen drops toward the threshold of consciousness loss, approximately 6 to 10% in the alveoli, CO2 rises simultaneously, but from the artificially low starting point created by hyperventilation. The CO2 reaches the compelling urge to breathe threshold only after oxygen has already dropped below consciousness threshold. The diver loses consciousness from hypoxia before any warning signal appears. Shallow water blackout occurs silently. No convulsions, no visible distress. The victim simply stops moving and sinks. Without an observer positioned to respond within seconds, the outcome is drowning. This mechanism is documented in competitive freediving fatalities, in military training incidents involving underwater breath hold exercises, and in recreational pool incidents. Hyperventilating before a breath hold dive to extend bottom time is removing the fuel warning light from a car to extend the trip. The fuel situation does not change. The warning disappears. You run out in the dark with no indication it was coming. 23. When equalization fails during descent, the instinctive response of most divers is to try harder. More force behind the Valsalva maneuver. More repeated attempts. Continue the descent while working on it. The reasoning is that effort and persistence should solve the problem. The physiology of what is actually happening during a failed equalization makes this reasoning counterproductive and directly injurious. The Valsalva maneuver works by increasing nasopharyngeal pressure to force open the eustachian tube. It requires the tube to be functional and patent. When the pressure differential has already built to a significant level during descent, the eustachian tube may be partially or fully collapsed under external pressure, making Valsalva insufficient regardless of force applied. Attempting to force a Valsalva against a collapsed eustachian tube dramatically elevates intracranial and inner ear pressure. This can rupture the oval or round window membranes within the inner ear, an injury called a paralymph fistula. Paralymph fistula produces sensorineural hearing loss, tinnitus, and episodic vertigo that can be permanent. Surgical repair is sometimes required. The injury results directly from the forceful equalization attempt, not from the original pressure differential. Alternative techniques, including the Frenzel maneuver and the Toynbee maneuver, are gentler and often more effective for divers who struggle with Valsalva. These require specific training that is not universally included in standard open water certification. The correct procedural response to failed equalization at any point during descent is to stop immediately and ascend 1 to 2 meters. This reduces the pressure differential enough to allow equalization to succeed, after which descent can resume slowly, with equalization performed every half meter. This requires willingness to lose depth, which is the obstacle. Divers who do not want to give up depth are the divers most likely to force equalization against a closed tube and sustain permanent inner ear damage. Congestion from illness, allergies, or sinus inflammation significantly impairs eustachian tube function and creates the conditions where forceful attempts are most likely to produce lasting injury. Divers Alert Network data confirms ear barotrauma as the highest volume dive injury category in the sport. Trying harder to equalize against a blocked tube is not determination. It is applying increasing force to a locked mechanism and expecting the wall to fail before the instrument does. 24 recreational divers with existing health coverage frequently bypass dive-specific insurance by reasoning that their existing plan handles medical emergencies, and dive insurance is a redundant expense designed to sell additional products to anxious people. This reasoning contains a specific and expensive factual error. Standard health insurance in most markets does not reliably cover hyperbaric oxygen therapy for decompression sickness treatment. Hyperbaric oxygen treatment is the primary, and in many cases, the only effective treatment for decompression sickness. It requires multiple sessions. Each session costs between $1,000 and $2,500. A moderate DCS case typically requires 3 to 10 sessions. A severe neurological case may require significantly more. The total treatment cost for a serious decompression sickness event can reach $25,000 or more before transportation costs are included. Standard health insurance policies in most markets classify hyperbaric oxygen treatment as a specialty medical service. Coverage is either excluded, limited to conditions specifically listed in the policy documentation, or subject to prior authorization that cannot realistically be obtained in an acute diving emergency. Decompression sickness is not universally listed as a covered condition in standard health insurance policy language. Hyperbaric chambers capable of treating dive-related injuries are not uniformly available. Many dive destinations, including islands and remote coastal areas, require medical evacuation by helicopter or fixed-wing aircraft to reach the nearest treating facility. Medical evacuation costs alone can reach $50,000 to $100,000 or more from remote dive locations. Divers Alert Network provides a 24-hour emergency hotline that coordinates with local emergency services and hyperbaric facilities globally. This coordination infrastructure does not exist within standard health insurance systems. The altitude problem from item 7 is relevant here as well. Mountain driving and commercial flight after diving create pressure environments that can trigger DCS events hours after the dive, in locations far from any dive emergency resources. Annual DAN membership with comprehensive dive accident coverage costs in the range of $30 to $80 per year. Skipping dive insurance because you have health coverage is like skipping flood insurance because you have homeowners insurance. Both policies are real. Neither one covers the specific catastrophe the other exists for. 25. Deep water carries a specific visual reputation built largely from film and documentary footage. Dramatic blue columns of light, crystal clarity, extraordinary visual range, and an almost cinematic quality of illumination. Divers and non-divers alike associate depth with better visibility and a more impressive visual environment. The actual optics of depth work in precisely the opposite direction from this impression. Light penetration in seawater is wavelength dependent. Red wavelengths are absorbed within the first few meters of the water column. Orange disappears by approximately 15 meters. Yellow is gone by 30 meters. At 60 meters and below, the visible spectrum available to a diver without artificial lighting is reduced almost entirely to shades of blue and green. The underwater world at depth is not dramatically lit. It is monochromatic, perceptually flattened, and entirely dependent on artificial lighting for anything resembling the color environment humans evolved to navigate. Photographic strobes and dive lights are standard equipment for underwater imaging at depth because the natural light environment at those depths does not contain the red and orange spectrum the human visual system uses for accurate color assessment and spatial perception. Visibility in meters, the horizontal or vertical distance a diver can clearly see, is determined by particulate matter suspended in the water column, not by depth. A shallow tropical reef with low biological particulate load can have 40 meters of horizontal visibility. A deep open ocean site in an upwelling zone with high plankton concentration can have 5 meters of visibility at the same depth where another site might have 30. Haloclines, which are boundaries between water masses of different salinity, produce optical refraction that makes objects appear blurry or doubled, similar to a heat mirage. A diver passing through a halocline can experience momentary complete loss of visual reference, particularly disorienting at depth with limited ambient light. Deep open water diving, called blue water or pelagic diving, involves descending into environments with no bottom reference, no reef structure, and no directional visual cue of any kind. Orientation is maintained entirely by instruments. Expecting to see better by going deeper is expecting to see better by turning off the lights. The aesthetic becomes more dramatic in documentation. The actual visibility gets consistently worse. 26. The submersible pressure gauge is treated by most recreational divers as a precise instrument, providing reliable real-time information about remaining gas supply. Divers watch the needle, plan around the number, and treat the reading as accurate enough to base safety-critical decisions on. This confidence is reasonable within limits, and those limits are where the gap between the gauge reading and the actual situation opens up. Analog submersible pressure gauges are mechanical instruments manufactured to accuracy tolerances. They are not laboratory instruments. They have failure modes, including needle sticking in cold water or after impact, that can produce false readings. In cold water, a gauge that appears to read correctly may be frozen at the last recorded pressure, while actual tank contents are dropping. The pressure-to-volume relationship at depth means that a specific pressure drop represents a different volume of actual breathing gas, depending on the depth at which it occurs. 500 psi at 30 meters represents less bottom time than 500 psi at 10 meters, because consumption rate at depth is proportional to ambient pressure. Divers who read their gauges in surface terms while operating at depth are systematically underestimating how fast they are consuming their reserve. The emergency reserve marked in red on many gauges, typically around 50 bar or 700 psi depending on gauge type, is not a comfortable operating zone. It is the margin calculated to cover an emergency ascent from the planned depth for the solo diver, plus air sharing requirements for a buddy emergency. Operating within this zone for routine dive extension rather than genuine emergency management eliminates the reserve it was designed to provide. Divers Alert Network reports consistently identify out-of-air events as one of the primary triggering factors in diving fatalities. The majority of these events are preceded by inadequate gas planning decisions rather than equipment failure, meaning the diver had information indicating the dive should have ended earlier. Tank valve creep, where a valve that has not been fully opened before the dive creates a progressive supply restriction, can cause breathing difficulty that appears suddenly without gauge change. Continuing to dive because the gauge still shows air is like continuing to drive because the fuel warning light has not appeared. The light does not announce an empty tank. It announces a nearly empty tank. What comes after the light is not a plan. 27 open water certification is the entry credential for recreational scuba diving and is widely understood as qualifying the holder for recreational diving in general. The certification is accepted at dive operations worldwide. It covers the foundational skills: equipment setup, descent, equalization, buoyancy control, mass clearing, emergency ascent, and basic navigation. The mental model attached to it is that a certified diver is a qualified diver, ready for recreational diving across its full range. The mental model is the problem. Open water certification standards across major agencies require approximately 4 to 5 checkout dives conducted in controlled conditions to a maximum of 18 meters. These dives are designed to verify that the student has achieved minimum competency in foundational skills under supervised conditions, not to develop robust proficiency across the full range of conditions the recreational diver may encounter. The conditions of certification dives, typically calm, warm, clear water at modest depths, may bear no resemblance to the conditions of subsequent dives. The certified diver books independently. A diver certified in warm, 20-meter visibility, 20-degree water is technically credentialed to dive in cold water, low visibility, moderate current, and 40-meter depth. None of those conditions were encountered or practiced during certification. Continuing education through advanced and specialty certifications progressively builds competency for specific conditions and environments, but these are optional in recreational frameworks. A diver can be open water certified and dive in significantly challenging conditions without ever holding any certification relevant to those conditions. Skill degradation is real and underappreciated. A diver certified 2 years ago who has not dived since is not operating at certification level proficiency. Physical skills require practice to maintain. Mass clearing, regulator recovery, and buoyancy control degrade without use, and certification does not preserve them through extended inactivity. Divers Alert Network fatality data shows meaningful representation of divers who had been certified for less than 1 year and divers returning after extended breaks. Two populations sharing the same gap between credentialed status and actual operating competency. Open water certification is a driver's license issued after 4 sessions in a parking lot. Technically valid on every road, not equivalent to being ready for every road. 28. Some recreational divers, particularly those diving without current computers, or those who have become comfortable enough to stop actively monitoring instruments, develop a sense that they can roughly estimate their depth from subjective cues. How dark it is, how their ears feel, how much effort buoyancy requires. The BCD feels about right for this depth. The light looks about like it did last time at this depth. This form of estimation is unreliable under normal conditions and becomes actively dangerous under precisely the conditions most likely to cause a diver to lose track of depth in the first place. Nitrogen narcosis, which was covered in detail in Item 5, specifically impairs both depth perception and self-assessment. The diver who is most likely to be at excessive depth without realizing it is the narked diver who is simultaneously least capable of accurately estimating how deep they are and most confident that they are doing fine. Water clarity and ambient light are not reliable depth indicators. Visibility varies enormously between sites and conditions. Artificial lighting at a dive site, overcast surface conditions, and suspended particulate matter all alter the ambient light environment in ways that are not correlated with depth. A diver cannot distinguish the buoyancy feel of 30 meters from 40 meters without instrumental confirmation, because buoyancy is affected by wetsuit compression. Gas consumption changes tank weight throughout the dive, and skill level influences how actively the diver is managing BCD inflation. No decompression limits are depth-specific and time-specific. A diver who drifts 10 meters deeper than planned without recognizing it is accumulating nitrogen against an NDL that is dramatically shorter than what the dive plan accounted for, potentially generating an unplanned decompression obligation with no awareness that it has occurred. Depth gauges and dive computers are required equipment in formally structured recreational dive programs because they provide reliable data that the diver's subjective perception cannot replicate and should not attempt to replace. Estimating your depth by feel is estimating your speed by engine sound. Under normal conditions, you might be roughly in the vicinity of correct. Under the conditions where accuracy matters most, the impairment that made the estimation necessary is precisely the impairment that makes the estimation worthless. 29. Recreational wreck diving is enormously popular. Wrecks provide structure, marine life concentration, historical interest, and the novelty of an unusual environment. Divers who are comfortable exploring reef environments look at accessible shipwrecks as natural extensions of the same activity, different scenery with the same underlying techniques. The transition feels intuitive. It is not. The critical distinction between wreck diving that is appropriate for recreational training and wreck diving that requires specific certification is penetration. Any entry into the interior of a wreck that moves a diver beyond the natural light zone constitutes overhead environment diving. In an overhead environment, a direct, unobstructed emergency ascent is not available. The diver must navigate back to the exit before ascending. This single structural difference transforms the management of every foreseeable emergency. An out-of-air event at 30 meters on a reef has a clear solution: buddy air share and ascend. An out-of-air event at 30 meters inside a wreck compartment requires navigating back to the exit while sharing air in low visibility before ascending. The problem is compounded by silt out. Wreck interiors accumulate thick sediment that disturbs instantly and completely at fin contact. A diver who silts out inside a wreck has zero visibility, no ambient light, and must navigate entirely by pre-laid guideline back to the exit. Without a guideline, a silted out wreck interior is a disorienting, zero visibility overhead environment with no reliable exit path. Wreck penetration certification, required by all major agencies for entry beyond the light zone, covers guideline techniques, redundant lighting systems, gas management using the rule of thirds, and emergency procedures specific to the overhead environment. Structural instability of aging wrecks is an additional factor. Metal corrodes, decking collapses, and structural elements that appeared stable on a previous dive can be compromised by further corrosion or current activity. Entanglement hazards, including fishing line, cables, and wiring, are present inside wrecks in quantities and configurations that are invisible in reduced visibility. Entering a wreck interior because you are comfortable diving around the outside of it is walking into a building construction site because you are comfortable walking past it. The outside and the inside are not governed by the same rules. 30. The dive training reflex that gets installed across all recreational certifications is that ascending is the correct response to trouble. When something feels wrong, when air is getting low, when a situation is unclear, the surface is safety, and getting there is the objective. This reflex is directionally correct and has a significant execution problem that is responsible for a category of dive deaths that are technically caused by the rescue attempt rather than the original incident. Uncontrolled emergency ascents, conducted rapidly, without managed breathing, and without safety stops, carry physiological risks that in some scenarios exceed the risk of the situation that prompted the ascent. Pulmonary barotrauma from a breath hold or excessively rapid ascent rate, covered in Item 1, is directly caused by the emergency ascent executed incorrectly. The diver survived the inciting event and was killed by the response to it. Decompression sickness from omitted decompression stops is directly caused by unplanned rapid ascent from dives that accumulated a decompression obligation. A diver who panics and ascends rapidly from a 35-meter, 25-minute dive without a safety stop is generating a measurable DCS risk while attempting to resolve a non-DCS problem. Uncontrolled buoyant ascent, where a diver becomes positively buoyant and cannot stop the rate of rise, is one of the most dangerous scenarios in recreational diving. BCD overinflation, an uncontrolled dry suit inflation, or sudden jettisoning of a weight belt can produce an ascent rate far exceeding safe limits. The diver has no way to slow it. The Controlled Emergency Swimming Ascent, abbreviated CESA, is the trained response to a no-air emergency. It requires continuous exhalation throughout the ascent at a maximum rate of 18 meters per minute and a safety stop if gas permits. This is a specific trained skill. It is not an intuitive behavior. It degrades without practice and is rarely executed correctly under actual emergency conditions by divers who last practiced it during their certification checkout dives. Dive computers include ascent rate alarms because rapid ascent is a physiological hazard that stressed divers do not self-regulate reliably. When in doubt, go up is correct. How you go up is the part that determines whether you arrive intact. The instinct without the training produces outcomes that look like rescues from the outside and function as something else entirely from the inside. 31. Non-divers frequently cite the complexity of diving rules, equipment requirements, and technical terminology as evidence that the sport is an expert-only activity with prohibitively high barriers and inherently unacceptable risk for an ordinary person. This impression is built from the outside looking in, and it is wrong in a direction that has a specific irony. The rules that make diving look complicated are the exact reason it is accessible. Recreational diving, conducted within its designed parameters with proper training and equipment, has a safety record comparable to moderate-risk recreational activities. Divers Alert Network statistical analysis places the mortality risk of recreational scuba diving at approximately 16 deaths per 100,000 divers per year. That figure is comparable in order of magnitude to running and cycling, activities not described as expert only. The overwhelming majority of recreational dive fatalities involve identifiable departures from established protocols: solo diving, out-of-air events from inadequate gas management, pre-existing cardiovascular conditions without medical clearance, or environmental overextension beyond the diver's training level. Rule following demonstrably and significantly reduces risk. The complexity of dive rules reflects the physiological sophistication of what is being managed. Nitrogen loading, oxygen partial pressure, thermal regulation, buoyancy, and pressure effects on the body and equipment. The rules are learnable, they are taught systematically, and they work. Major certifying agencies collectively certify hundreds of thousands of new divers every year. Millions of recreational dives are completed annually without incident. The medical clearance process for diving is straightforward for the majority of adults. Primary exclusions are specific cardiovascular and respiratory conditions. Most people can obtain clearance. The equipment operates through trained procedures, not through engineering expertise. A diver does not need to understand the internal mechanics of a first-stage regulator any more than a driver needs to understand internal combustion. The paradox worth noting is that the population most often harmed by the rules is not beginners who respect them. It is experienced recreational divers who have logged enough comfortable dives to begin treating established protocols as unnecessary conservatism. The rules are not the obstacle between an ordinary person and the underwater world. They are the entire reason that ordinary people can descend into an environment that will kill them in minutes without life support and return to the surface. The complexity is the access. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.